റോബിനെ ഇവിടെ അവതരിപ്പിച്ചു കഴിഞ്ഞു. അദ്ദേഹം വളരെ വർഷങ്ങളായി ഇംഗ്ലീഷിൽ, പ്രധാനമായും ഇംഗ്ലീഷിലും ചിലപ്പോൾ മണിപ്പുരി ഭാഷയിലും കവിത എഴുതുന്ന കവിയാണ്. കവിതയെക്കുറിച്ച് ആഴത്തിൽ ആലോചിച്ചിട്ടുള്ള ഒരാളാണ്. ഒപ്പം തന്നെ അവിടെ നടക്കുന്ന സംഭവങ്ങളെക്കുറിച്ച് വളരെയധികം ഉത്കണ്ഠ പുലർത്തുന്ന ഒരാളാണ്. അവിടെ നടക്കുന്ന ഒരു വംശീയമായ സംഘർഷം മിക്കവാറും ഉണ്ടാക്കപ്പെട്ട ഒരു സംഘർഷമാണ് എന്ന് നന്നായി തിരിച്ചറിയുന്ന ഒരാളാണ്. So I hope you will use Robin's presence as a kind of context for asking about what's happening in Manipur and also his response to Manipur, but primarily about his poetry, how he approaches the art of poetry and how he came to write more in English than in Manipuri, though he also keeps writing in Manipuri and also translating from Manipuri, because he has done some of the best translations of other Manipuri poets like Ibo Pishak Singh and Tangjom Ibo Pishak and quite a few other major Manipuri poets. So he can speak about poetry, about translation, about the sad plight that now Manipur is going through. So I welcome him as an old friend and of course as one of the leading poets of northeastern India and perhaps India itself. Thank you, Robin, for being here, and you are free to engage the audience, and they may have some questions at the end which you can try to respond to. Yeah,
thank you. The ILFK for giving me this opportunity to air my verse, and thank you K. Satchidanandan, who has always been a source of inspiration for me, and he has also been a vital supporter of not only me from the Northeast but many other poets from the Northeast. I will always be indebted to him. I think I am actually ill-equipped to talk about poetry from Manipur, although I'm sure many of you would like to hear about Manipur, about the present crisis in Manipur. Manipur is in the news for all the wrong reasons. I wrote an autobiographical piece which actually appeared in 2018. It was published in Indian Literature, and I think this piece will still be relevant, although I'm sure it happens to most of the poets. A poet is a very slippery, very dodgy animal. So the views that I have expressed in this piece that I wrote in 2018 might have changed a little now, but I have talked about again, unfortunate events which happened during the 90s, and again, ironically, those events are being are being repeated again now. Anyway, so please bear with me. This it's interspersed with lines from my own poetry. So this autobiographical piece. I wrote my first faltering line in the relative innocence of childhood. I was about 11 or 12 years old then, and caught as I was in the flush of youth, I wanted to explore the world by writing ornate and sentimental poetry. Since life was ignoring me, I thought I could engage the attention of kindred hearts through friendly and soft-hearted verse. Naturally, my poems were mostly inspired by romances and adventure stories, especially The 1001 Nights, but it was essentially dreamy-eyed adolescent stuff. I still have not grown out of it. One favorite poem of mine began with the line, "The boy stood on the burning deck." That well-meaning world is no longer recognizable now. The sacred landmarks have disappeared long since. Only dim memories of hoisting the country's flag on a holiday, or leading a blind man by the hand, or praying in temples on a feast day remain as mute reminders of that sacred past. Manipur, my native place in northeast India, is in a state of anarchy, and my poetry springs from the cruel contradictions of that land. Manipur boasts of its talents in theater, cinema, dance, and sports. But how could you trust your own people when they entrust corruption, AIDS, terrorism, and drugs to their children? Naturally, the Manipur that I ritually go back to from the laid-back hill town of Shillong every year is not a sacred world of my childhood, because childhood took place free from manly fears when I had only my mother's love to protect me from knives, from fire, and death by water. I wore it like an amulet. Childhood took place among fairies and were-tigers when hills were yours to tumble before they became soldiers' barracks and dreaded chambers of torture. Childhood took place before your friend worshipped a gun to become a widow maker. Having acknowledged this growing restlessness within myself, poetry became an outlet for pent-up feelings and desires, where I can bear myself without actually being demonstrative. Poetry, therefore, has remained an underground exercise with me. It perhaps began as a dialogue with the self and has become an illegitimate affair of the heart, because I believe in the poetry of feeling, within quotes, which can be shared, not cerebral intellectual poetry, which is inaccessible sometimes, and which leaves the reader outside the poet's insulated world. I suppose I have always tried in a naive way to invite the reader into my small world. Perhaps I've written poems because I've felt this desperate need to be understood and to be accepted. I want to describe myself again and again to people who do not know me. That is why I always look for paper and ink, even in the midst of a terrible loss or a dangerous illness, because someone said, the spoken word flies, but the written word stays. In many ways, my own Meitei culture, which is part of my childhood, has shaped my thinking. Perhaps we all mourn the fate of our homeland, as the Sicilian poet Quasimodo has said. And though I have never remotely imagined myself as any conscience keeper, I've often tried to speak of my people and of the terrible things happening in Manipur. The title of the poem is Native Land, and this was written in the early 90s. First came the scream of the dying in a bad dream, then the radio report and a newspaper. 6 shot dead, 25 houses razed, 16 beheaded with hands tied behind their backs inside a church. As the days crumbled and the victors and the victims grew in number, I hardened inside my thickening hide until I lost my tenuous humanity. I ceased thinking of abandoned children inside blazing huts, still waiting for their parents. If they remembered their grandmother's tales of many winter hurts at the hour of sleeping death, I didn't want to know. If they ever learnt the magic of letters. And the women, heavy with seed, their soft bodies mown down like grain stalk during their lyric harvest. If there were wildflowers in their hair while they waited for their men. I didn't care anymore. I burnt my truth with them and buried uneasy manhood with them. I didn't mutter on some far-off day, there are limits. But when the day absorbed the butchers, I continued to live as if nothing happened. I don't agree with the view that a writer requires a tradition to lean upon, to till the soil which others have made fertile, and harvest ideas for himself. A writer can be influenced by anything, and he would be able to write in any country other than his own. But he has to reclaim his individual voice. It is natural for someone from the northeast of India to exploit the folk traditions he grew up with, to write of the hills when he's living in the hills. It is Shillong that has moved me into this kind of poetry. Shillong with its gentle hills, the Khasis with a rich oral literature. I told you the stories of old on soft Sundays of Manik Raitong and Kalikai. Only the stones of unknown gorges weep for them, I said. We awakened sleeping melodies and talked of native lands and my foolish youth, where the pines read the lips of the wind and silent rain drums the hills. The cottages dry their eyes and open them in the dusk. The land of the 7 huts, they have named these hills. You would belong here if you would listen to your heart. If I had not made use of this hill world, my poetry would have been false. You would notice this preponderance of images from the hills in many of my poems. The vast pines, the mountains with their great rains. But this, I have realized, is mostly artless, inoffensive poetry. For someone who has suffered from a fundamental poverty of experience, I have been naturally inclined towards the personal lyric. I don't have faith in inspiration, but since poetry cannot originate in a vacuum, I have also left my influences open and have allowed myself to be ambushed by political events, books, biased memory, a dogged sexuality, womankind, films, streets even. But my poetry seems to be drifting towards something more. It is no longer a mere diary of private incidents or a confessional. I've been trying to come to terms with this change of heart, which is even more distressing than the shattered love of a woman. And I have perhaps opened my eyes to insistent realities and have stepped out of the proverbial ivory tower. If anyone should ask now why my poems do not speak of my land's breathtaking landscapes, its sinuous dances, its dark-maned women, I can only offer Neruda's answer: come and see the blood in the streets. The writer from Northeast India, consequently, differs from his counterpart in the mainland in a significant way. While it may not make him a better writer, living with the menace of the gun does not permit him to indulge in verbal wizardry or woolly aesthetics, but is a consistent reminder that he must perforce master, within quotes, the art of witness. Forces working under slogans that have been twisted, slogans such as self-determination, rive my society. We have witnessed growing ethnic aggressiveness, secessionist ventures, cultural and religious bigotry, the marginalization of minorities and the poor, profit and power struggles in government, and as a natural aftermath to these, the banality of corruption and the banality of terror. Further, the uneasy coexistence of paradoxical worlds such as the folk and the westernized, virgin forest and car-choked streets, ethnic cleansers and the parasites of democracy, ancestral values and flagrant materialism, resurgent nativism, and a sensitive outsider's predicament make the picturesque Northeast especially vulnerable to tragedy. And what can a poet aspirant do in such contrary circumstances when he can no longer nurse a magical vision of the world? For the first time, I begin to understand Camus's words. I quote Camus, "Whatever our personal weaknesses may be, the nobility of our craft will always be rooted in 2 commitments, difficult to maintain. The refusal to lie about what one knows and a resistance to oppression. Today, when cruel suppositions are made about the conceit of the artist, innuendos that the poet has become a world unto himself and should be brought to his knees, when there is a sharp divide between modest criticism and literature, when literary schools are merely reactionary and seem to be turning their eyes from what is known as the human condition, I would again like to reaffirm my indebtedness to my fellow men. Today, when heart-rending events are happening all around a poet, when all he hears are chilling accounts of what man has done to man, how can he close his eyes to the brutalization of life and remain solipsistic? Anyone with even an iota of conviction is in immediate danger if he speaks up. A gun points at you if you don't observe a prescribed code of behavior. How then can I claim that I'm living in a free society? In contemporary Manipuri poetry, there is a predominance of images of bullets, blood, mother, the color red, and paradoxically, flowers too. A poet from Imphal told me how they have been honing what he calls the poetry of survival, with guns pressed to both temples, the gun of revolution and the gun of the state. Hardly anyone writes romantic verse or talks about disturbing aspects of sexuality because they are absorbed in writing the poetry of survival. This has resulted in criticism that contemporary Manipuri poetry is hemmed in by extreme realism. There is, of course, a danger of the images listed above becoming hackneyed, and maybe poets should try to strike that balance between realism and reflection, as the Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai skillfully does in his poem, The Diameter of the Bomb. The opening lines of this poem read like statistics and a news report that we often ignore as we go on with our daily lives. The diameter of the bomb was 30 centimeters and the diameter of its effective range about 7 meters, with 4 dead and 11 wounded. But the lines that follow make us reflect on lives obliterated by mindless violence. They reveal how violence transforms men and women, regardless of nationalities, and also how such mindless acts make one reflect on the indifference of a God who, if he exists at all, should never allow his creation to be erased or reduced to an absurd drama. But poets also have to write about the here and now, and writing about it lends a sense of immediacy and vividness to this poetry, to their poetry. I call this the poetry of witness. In Manipur, when the reality becomes oppressive, a few poets frequently seek refuge in absurdist irony, often directed towards oneself, in parody and in satire. It is a rejection by these poets of the extreme realism I have mentioned. They, in turn, also reveal an inclination towards the surreal. In Manipuri poet Y. Ibomcha's Story of a Dream, murderous bullets turn into luscious fruits. And in Tangzab Ibopisak's I Want to Be Killed by an Indian Bullet, terrorists appear in the guise of the 5 elements, Panchabhut, so this kind of verse is a reaction to the absurdity of violence and death. When the Manipuri poet's existence is reduced to negotiating the subject matter of guiltless addicts, child soldiers, and young mothers with AIDS. Literature that is not the breath of contemporary society, that does not transmit the pains and fears of that society, that does not warn in time against threatening moral and social dangers, such literature does not deserve the name of literature. It is only a facade, claims Alexander Solzhenitsyn. But here lies a paradox. Because the writer is not beholden to anyone, let alone to society, he must be true only to his own world and to himself. A writer is not a self-assigned conscience keeper. Living in society, he will talk about his milieu, the people with whom he is in touch with daily. But you cannot expect a writer to consciously promote, say, ethnic harmony as a part of his writing program. You cannot expect a writer to be a public relations official on behalf of any organization or a propagandist for any cause. On the other hand, there is often a defiant and self-damaging streak in him that sometimes incites him to confront authority. In 1964, when Joseph Brodsky was asked by Soviet authorities what he did for a living, he replied that he wrote poetry. And he was immediately arrested on the charge of social parasitism. So is the writer a social parasite or a conscience keeper for his society? One thing is certain: he values his freedom above everything else and will protect it fiercely. I think the task that literature of the Northeast must address is what Albert Camus called the double challenge of truth and liberty. Truth, because what can the writer hope to accomplish now except tell the truth? When the unspeakable is out there being enacted and quickly consigned to oblivion, when cruel things are done but never undone, and when media machines are busy feeding the world one-sided lies, the writer can only tell the truth about what he knows. Literature cannot bring harmony or a moral revolution by telling us what we must do. And forces are always at work to rob the writer of his freedom. Liberty, therefore, is a necessary precondition which the writer must fight for in order to tell the truth he knows. Freedom is the lifeblood of his art. So during these fraught times, these pessimistic times, the responsibility of the writer is much more modest than what well-meaning people would like him to shoulder. That is to change the world into a better place through his efforts. But at most, poetry of the Northeast can only mirror the body and mind of the times, as in Thangzam Ibopisek's poem. Now, in this country, one cannot speak aloud. One cannot think in the open. Hence, poem, like a flower I sport with you. Before my eyes, incident upon incident, awesome, heaving events, walking, yet sleeping, eyes open, but dreaming, standing, yet having nightmares, in dreams and in reality, only fearsome, shivery instances. Surround me, closing eyes, palms on ears, molding the heart to a mere clay object. I write poems about flowers. Now in this land, one should only think of flowers, dream about flowers. For my little baby, my wife, for my job, to protect myself. Surrounded as we are by playthings we don't need, when a man's worth is determined by what he can buy, we are continuously taught to be grateful to the capitalist God. What we have inherited then are the tyrannical fetishes of market capitalism, or whatever you call it now, murderous technologies and grisly ideologies that would leave a cursed earth for our children. How can poetry sing the praises of this age or compose hymns to Mammon? For me, poetry can never be an ally of this numbing materialism or a party to mindless violence. Materialism, wherever it abounds, begets a particular kind of terrifying alienation, for the simple reason that we forfeit our ability to love when we place commodities above our fellow men. And someone who cannot love is always alone. So these hostile forces have often compelled poetry to burrow deeper into itself. It has retreated into a cell of obscurity and isolation. In such precarious times, writing poetry is always a defiant gesture that poets make against power and money, insensitivity and terror. Poetry cannot help anyone to get on in life. or make a successful human being out of anyone. But poetry should move us. It should change us in such a manner that we remain no longer the same after we have read a meaningful poem. For all these reasons, a poet can never be a conformist. He may not be an anarchist, a nihilist, or an inquisitor, but by the token of his verse, he is a natural dissident. The Polish Nobel laureate, Miłosz, I think that's how it's pronounced, questions the efficacy of poetry in his poem titled Dedication. What is poetry which does not save nations or people? A connivance with official lies? A song of drunkards whose throats will be cut in a moment? But Miłosz would not espouse his native language or champion his people's cause unquestioningly. As he says in my poem, My Faithful Mother Tongue. Now I confess my doubt. There are moments when it seems to me I have squandered my life. For you are a tongue of the debased, of the unreasonable, hating themselves even more than they hate the other nations. A tongue of informers, a tongue of the confused, ill with their own innocence. Poetry is always an act of subversion. And paradoxically, the poet is perhaps the most ironic realist. No more for him the security of an ivory tower or the temptations of utopia. In the poem, Who is a Poet?, the Polish writer and poet Tadeusz Różewicz, I'm not sure about the pronunciation, offers with certitude an ambivalent definition. A poet is one who writes verses and one who does not write verses. A poet is one who throws off fetters and one who puts fetters on himself. A poet is one who believes and one who cannot bring himself to believe. A poet is one who has told lies and one who has been told lies, and one who has been inclined to fall and one who raises himself. A poet is one who tries to leave and one who cannot leave. Each word must be fashioned from a private hurt, and writing poetry is perhaps like trying to keep a deadline with death. Perhaps I'm always dying, yet I listen willingly to the words of life that I have never understood, wrote the Sicilian poet Quasimodo. That is why I've always felt that poetry should not merely amuse us or make us think. It should comfort us, and it must heal the heart of man. So this is the autobiographical piece that I wrote, a long time ago. I'm no longer certain about poetry healing the heart of man, or we talk about literature being a place of shelter, or poetry providing shelter. I'm not sure about that. I think poetry also needs to, because poets sometimes get drunk with their own words or with the words of poetry. So I think poetry also needs to disenchant and to disintoxicate. But of course, poets have different strategies and different realities of their own. I don't know how much. Okay, that's half an hour. Yeah. Sorry. This is a poem that I wrote recently in response to the turmoil in Manipur. Not a very good poem. I mean, I'm not happy with it at all, but Anyway, the title of the poem is Suffering. That's the title of the poem. I have read Suffering. I have read of this universal condition. I told myself I knew a bit of it, having had little brushes with it. Then, on perfect, out of the blue days of evil, the indescribable voice of a young man whimpering for his life while being bludgeoned and then shot. A simple father sobbing for his simple child and wife, burnt alive in an ambulance that raised any hope. The horrific shame and ordeal of a young woman paraded starkly naked before sadistic eyes. The mute agony of an 80-year-old woman frozen on her charred face. The blunt bullet blow to a woman who had already lost her mind when shot in the face. A wife howling for her husband's life, even as his killers mocked her over the phone. Already a husband, a father, a lover, a mere human, I thought I could relive these pains as if to know them, as if I can prepare myself if any such pain should strike me out of the blue. But realize I cannot categorize suffering at all, and there may be hitherto undiscovered pains. This cold gift on our day of birth, which may yet indeed be universal. This one is a poem titled Myanmar Story. This is in response to an event that they call 8888. That happened in 1988. That was when Aung San Suu Kyi also emerged as a leader. She was not directly involved in this event. There was an uprising against the military government then, when people from all walks of life, teachers and monks and students and doctors, were killed and many of them imprisoned. And I would like to talk about Myanmar because Myanmar has a special importance in connection even with the crisis in Manipur now. It has to do with geopolitics. I'm sure many of you know about it already. In this poem, I have made references to Pablo Neruda, who also lived in Rangoon. He had a relationship with an Anglo-Burmese woman, and he wrote wonderful poems about his relationship, about his love for this woman. Anyway, that's another story. So Myanmar story. I come from Manipur, and there are two border towns, one inside India in Manipur. That's a place called More. There's a lot of trouble there, even as I speak. And another place called Tamu, a border town inside Myanmar. And I often used to visit. We have this free regime movement, so Indians also can go there without a visa. Then Burmese also can come into India, into Manipur without a visa. Anyway, so I used to visit Tamu, often in the past. Myanmar story. That country where I return in memory to dim travels of a child, where serpentine roads of a long war, that would be the Second World War. I think many of you perhaps don't know that the fiercest battles of the Second World War was actually fought in the northeast, in Manipur and in Nagaland, these two places, Kohima and Imphal. So I'm referring to that war, So where serpentine roads of a long war send me to its twilight borders, to its fair women with raven hair and sandalwood breast, its poor rice fields and hills rain-bound, and monasteries old in wisdom, Buddhist monasteries and monasteries old in wisdom. That journey was made some time ago as only wistfulness would allow. Once a poet explorer from equatorial distances, Pablo Neruda, with unknown blood sinking in his heart, walked its streets, marveled at its strange gods, loved anxiously, and discovered loneliness. But these are darker days, my love. I have borrowed actually this technique of addressing my poem to a beloved, So mixing, in a sense, politics and love, So there's a technique that I have actually borrowed from Pablo Neruda. So it's addressed to a beloved, imaginary woman, beloved, So, but these are darker days, my love, when freedom has become a rare metal that must be mined from cruel intelligences. There is nothing more bitter than hearts of men without a country. I'm talking about the people who fled from Myanmar during this uprising in 1988. Many of them came to India, to the northeast. Many of them took shelter in Delhi. They even had their own radio station, radio channel, and a newspaper called Mizima News. So there's nothing more bitter than hearts of men without a country, more terrible than the exile of young men and women who only want to make their people see with words, not guns, pleading with indifferent countries, protesting with colors and alphabets against a senseless crushing of flowers. So the Burmese exiles in Delhi then, in 88, they had put up a painting exhibition. And this painting, one of the paintings is titled A Senseless Crushing of Flowers. So I'm telling the story of Myanmar and its brave daughters deserted by the big brothers of the West, reference to Aung San Suu Kyi, and democracy weeping in its tropical forest. I speak of incessant tears hidden in the folds of intoxicating freedom. Listen, love, to Burma's story. Once the East's pearl, they call it the pearl of the East. So once the East pearl, now the bauble of democracy, the elusive white man's cross that natives carry, causing its physicians, students, and priests to mourn their native land's fate, to sing fugitive songs around the world, hoping only songs will preserve fragile sanity in a mad country where bandits come riding in tanks to greet its citizens. Generals enslaved by their own horrors, purging their terrors by uprooting fields and gardens, exterminating before things could grow into nightmares. My love, in my dream where they tear a green heart from the hill's ribs in steamy jungles, I'm referring to jade mining. So where they tear a green heart from the hill's ribs in steamy jungles, for the idle whites swooping on Rangoon, they have jade auctions, So anyway, whites come and, Americans and others. So for the idle whites swooping on Rangoon, who will take away jade souvenirs to remind themselves of a subject race, I carried you across slopes of my war-torn mind, leaving furrows of lead, and put flaming orchids in your bridal hair. In my dream, each drop of blood sprouts a humming voice that the bandits throttled. But the running blood grows in clamor, answering unerringly to new voices. Okay. I've been living in Shillong mostly, so I've written poems not just about Manipur, but about Shillong and about places that I've visited in Northeast, where I lived in the Northeast. But anyway, okay. Two short poems written in the Chinese mode. These two poems use a popular Khasi story of star-crossed lovers. U Manik Raitong, this is Khasi name. Raitong means the wretched one. An orphaned youth had an illicit affair with the king's wife. The king is called Siim, in Khasi. In fact, Bhupen Hazarika made a film on Manik Raitong, it's called Liang Macau. Anyway, so when the affair came to light, the king's council decreed U Raitong's death. An accomplished musician, U Raitong planted his bamboo flute in the earth before his immolation. And it is believed that the bamboo flute took root. And maybe they say, the bamboos, are still have still survived, where he planted his bamboo flute, So it's two parts. The first part, at the end of autumn, sitting near the window. It is the 9th moon, and already a shiver runs down the back of the hill. In calm solitude, I latch my door, wondering if I'll ever see plum blossoms again. So, actually, Manik Raitong, the wretched one, he's an orphan youth. The story goes that actually he doesn't have any friends. He lived in complete isolation, and he used to play the flute. And actually, the king's wife was enchanted by his flute playing. That's why when the king was away, and she came to meet him in the dead of night, and that's how they developed a relationship. They fell in love. So in this poem, I have imagined myself as his confidant. The speaker in this poem. The only one in whom he confided. So in calm solitude, I latch my door, wondering if I'll ever see plum blossoms again. Blinking among pines, the autumn stars, silk spun moonlight, and silver stream breaking over stones. Laden peasants from day's end, bringing winterwood to the Siem's mansion. The Siem is the king, so bringing winterwood to the Siem's mansion. How sad is the lot of my friend Manik, spilling his heart from the 7 mouths of his flute, even though he has dared to wear the flower of the Siem. So this is an expression, it's used in Manipur, in Meitei Loan also. It's an idiomatic expression. Wearing a flower means to fall in love, to have an affair. So Manik Raitong wore the flower of the Siem, that is the king's wife, the queen. The next part is titled Spring at Ribhoi. Ribhoi is the district from where Manik Raitong comes from, So Spring at Ribhoi. Winter withdraws quietly from the Ribhoi hill. Like white reeds to deck the late year's coffin, peach blossoms fall in spring wind. Swept clean by March's wind, the hills, fog melting from the nestling hamlet, and green are the pines skirting it. Laughing children on their way to meadows, men and women with plows before the industrious season. Because life falls as petals and death comes when least expected, none remembers the passing of Manik Raitong and how he planted his bamboo flute for earth to play music in spring. But cold, cold is the Siam's heart, the king's heart. But cold, cold is the Siam's heart, and spring has not visited his garden. Okay, that is the poem. I don't know what to read. This is a poem titled During Easter. This is about my student days in Shillong, predominantly Christian city. So you have Easter celebrations on a grand scale, So anyway, this poem is titled During Easter. Winter languishes in the street like an old man who refuses to stir. When constellations swing ingeniously and cherries turn red like the luminous lips of girls eager for kisses. The streets are only half emptied. Not everyone has gone to witness the resurrection of the Son of God. On Maundy Thursday, no one washes the feet of the poor as the Son of Man washes the feet of his automobile. But the miracle is here on earth as flesh and blood celebrate the wonder of meaningless life in the acridness of tear-filled rain falling from already sleepy skies. And yesterday's bitterness fades the moment you forgive every bastard and whore, and only thanksgiving follows the shock of being alive. On Easter Sunday, walk in the wind that lingers in your hair, or stand immobile like a grey carving in the public square after squandering your last rupee on a bottle, and laugh at the Son of Man who anoints his car. Under Easter stars, listen to the haunted organ lifting a ghostly hymn, and pray with a Paschal candle in your heart for the sorrow of the woman shut out from a church. Sorry? I didn't get you, sorry. Yes, yeah, okay. All right. Okay, I'll read just one more poem, which talks about, different communities in the Northeast and the shared stories and etc. Anyway, the title of the poem is from the book of Grievances. It talks about the Northeast and the communities of the Northeast. From here, day weeps in the failing light, and the evenings are misty-eyed. The eaves drip pastoral dew. Dark green are leaves of June, hung on the clothesline of rain. The hills remain impassive with an old reputation of silence, and none knows about our dreams, muffled now as if by blaring progress, put to shame before ornate streets. In the evenings, proud hearts that have learnt to die well return in the bronze dusk. But something has been buried, something akin to hope and dreams. Our souls shall not speak, not an indignant word shall escape our lips. And if they cannot hear the silent moan of our hearts, we will not implore pity. Implacable death came upon us, and the finest memories are of no worth. Proud ancestral names, faithful women with raven hair, the heroic struggles of our small lives. What is tradition and our history but only death with a long memory? For how long shall we make our forefathers walk as spirits? Today, with grief sitting on our hearts, we will sing of clouds that did not come home. We will sing the songs of those banished in mountains. We will drink deep from bamboo mugs and wipe remembrance from lips. From a trajectory of dark deeds, our days fly towards destinations in uncharted galaxies of time. Broken skylines clutch the hills, bringing a momentary fear of the earth shaker who turns violently in his sleep. As we sauntered along overgrown trails, the hill's night sang to us, but concealed its midst of famine and pestilence. A party of egrets followed us in the fog one January morning. When we stole into the fog's body, we again entered our history, leaving all milestones behind. In these native villages, beneath the bamboo and watching hills, seated on mats of clouds, we could see the glint of paddy fields, gripped by rain and mist. Once we sprinkled mutual libations to create these jade and emerald fields. My love, something I cannot name seems to be ashamed of our dances. Even as we hide our roots like gnarled limbs, we begin to disown what we cherish. Fidelity, openness, daring. We must learn quickly before the devious ones mutilate our names carved on monoliths. Time ran out in Oinam, in Ukhrul. These are places in Manipur where terrible human rights violations took place, crimes against humanity took place. Time ran out in Ukhrul, in Oinam, when they who gave us a republic brought reconcentrados from the Americas, watched impassively the smoking fields, prodded with clubs the bruised vagina, the shocked testis. We became impotent in the face of mortification. Today we will bury tradition's fetus. We will not weave unparalleled history where there was no homespun yarn. We, the worthy henchmen of tyranny, will embrace the villain's principles. We will desert honor, and a vain hope for peace will burn our hills. When we scream and our throats rasp, we will spit wanton civilization in the eye. As east meets west in the hills' crack, blind Venus roots grope under earth, we turn our own perpetrator, victim of our own dark deeds. It is all very fine, long sacrificing brother of the night. Your state-of-the-art rifle commands awe. When you procure your ignominious arsenal, can you smother the sibilant whispers in the valleys and hills? Can you answer the cries of children and widows? You singe the flower of youth with a pious lamp in your veins, but our homes have been herded away, for our fields to lie fallow, and our young and old spread maimed hands, for the intractable belly, the naked skin. Okay, thank you.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
So, as a prominent writer from Northeast India, have you ever felt that there is a discrimination, or rather, otherization for the literatures, especially from Northeast India, a mainland literature as well as an other Northeast Indian literature? Because even as students, we were not aware of many of the, at least read prominent authors from Northeast India. It's only after getting into a research stream, I happened to learn much more about Northeast Indian literature, and also finding that to talk about magical realism, we need not go to Gabriel or someone else like this. Just from from the 8 states of Northeast Indian literature itself gives an epitome of magical realism about orality, about tradition, etc. So have you ever felt as an author being discriminated because this is a literature which is often discarded, decredited, and devalued? Have you ever felt like that? And also, my next question is regarding the position of women in Northeast India. Though it's a misnomer terming as Northeast India, I know the fact that because all the 8 states have its own they are heterogeneous with its cultural affinities, etc. But for my convenience, I'm using that particular term, Northeast India, because I have heard that the women of Northeast India, they are suffering from 3 fronts. I mean, violence. They are receiving violence from 3 fronts. First one, from the draconian measures of Indian Army, of course, because of the implementation of rules like UPSPA Act. And the second one would be from the counter-insurgencies that are happening nowadays, pertaining to ethical insurgencies. And also from the traditional impact, the different ethnicities over there. So the patrilineal, much more patrilineal custom that's been happening in Northeast Indian tradition. So what's your account on this women's position, as well as being a writer from Northeast India, your experience with compared to the mainstream literature?
I don't think there is any conscious attempt at marginalization of Northeast writers from, if you can use the word mainland, I don't know, but I'm sure it's true of even the Northeasterners themselves. So we know very little about each other. Say if you talk about the Northeast and the mainland, but we're simply not either not interested or not curious about the history and politics of different communities, different regions, but I think many Northeastern writers, who the ones who most write in English, they have been, they've earned increasing recognition, and the big publishers have come to the Northeast, and and many of them have been published. They won accolades, prizes. I don't know, but as I mentioned, this lack of curiosity about the history and the politics and culture and myths of the Northeast, I think it happens to all of us. To all the regions, in India, how curious are the Northeasterners about the South or about the North? I used to think, Manipur is in the news because of for all the wrong reasons, because of the present turmoil. So I used to think about Auden's poem about suffering. I don't know how to pronounce Musea da Boa Art or something. Suffering. So you have heard about the suffering in Manipur. That's why maybe you want to know about Manipur, more about Manipur, about the politics there, about history there. So suffering, what Auden said, is suffering goes on around us all the time. It passes us unawares, unless it happens to you. So we ignore suffering. So in the same way, maybe we ignore the stories, the history and the politics of other people, because you have your own stories and you're so immersed in your own stories and your own politics. Maybe that's the reason why, So I know, but I don't think that we have been consciously, marginalized. And about the patriarchal or patrilineal or patriarchal, I don't know the difference between patrilineal and patriarchal society. I think it's true of most Indian, I think, communities. I have been thinking more about because it's a reality that we ignore as we go on with our lives, even as we write poetry or pursue the other arts, the mainstream arts, as if the climate. I'm no doomster, but as the climate doom has not started, or is not coming our way. We human beings take pride in our achievements throughout the centuries, but we consider ourselves to be rational beings. But can you think of any other species which consciously poisons its own air, its own food, and its own water? So I mentioned that I've been responding to when we talk about poetry, my own poetry, I've been responding to my subjective realities. So at one time I've been I often used to write about the agonizing political situation in Manipur in the northeast. But now I've started talking to trees. I've started talking to ants and squirrels. So we are, as I mentioned, we are very dodgy. I think, you can't typecast a poet. You can't say the poet is a political poet or a love poet or a social poet. I think you should give a poet his freedom to be anything that he chooses. Let's think about Keats's chameleon poet. Yes, okay. I don't know whether I. Sorry? Okay. Translations.
So good afternoon, sir. Actually, I want to ask you a bold question, whether did Manipur really experience the cultural genocide of Christians as a person who saw it with your eyes? And did the Hindu fundamentalist, the fanatic nationalist purposefully destroy the churches? Actually, I want to know as a Keralite. Because there's a...
Sorry, no, I didn't actually get you.
Sir, actually the question is did Manipur really experience a cultural genocide of Christians?
Cultural?
Genocide. Genocide.
Cultural genocide.
A genocide, okay.
Cultural genocide, that's... a genocide of Christians.
Christians.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm no political analyst. I know I've been living mostly in a place called Shillong, not exactly in Manipur. So I don't have the facts and figures with me. But I think the word genocide has been used very casually. I can tell you with certainty there's no genocide. There's no genocide in Manipur. And now everyone uses these words, phrases, ethnic cleansing, genocide freely, But unless you go there, I mentioned about one-sided lies being fed by media machines. So, and I'm sorry to say that some leftist ideologues and have been reading the situation in Manipur as reducing it to a mere binary of the Hindu majority, persecuting the tribal minority, and this is not because I belong to the Hindu majority community, but there's no such. It cannot be reduced to that. Religion has nothing to do with it, and even about a minority and the majority, it's a very shaky kind of area. We don't really know who's actually in the majority or who's in the minority. Now, but I think whatever little that I heard in my own understanding, I think it has to do with assertion of identity, actually, and of course nationalism, whatever you call it, conflicting or identities, actually. And unless you go there, you will not be. It's a little complex, maybe very layered. It has to do with geopolitics. It has to do with drugs, where again, where everyone is involved. All the communities are involved. It is not just the cookies who are involved in drugs. All the communities are involved. So it has to do with unimaginable amount of money concerning drugs, heroin, and poppy cultivation. It has to do with geopolitics. It has to do with this assertion of identities, creation of homelands. I mean, that's how I would look at it, Okay. Time is over. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me and listening to me.